The blade does not rush. It waits, suspended in its wooden throat, patient in the way only machines can be. Wood creaks, iron breathes, an entire city leans forward, not in anger or joy, but in curiosity. This is not an execution. It is an experiment. For centuries, power has claimed it is heavier than flesh, older than bone, immune to gravity. Today, gravity is about to respond. A neck is placed where an idea has been sitting for a very long time. When the blade finally drops, it will not argue. It will not explain. It will simply demonstrate a rule the universe has always enforced with quiet cruelty. Anything that rises far enough eventually becomes testable. Anything testable can fail. The crowd will cheer, but the real sound will be silence, the kind that follows the shattering of a superstition. Power, stripped of costume, bleeds exactly like everything else. History does not flinch. It only records the moment belief lets go. The head falls, and something far older than the man collapses with it. Not a dynasty yet, not even a regime. What dies first is the spell, the idea that authority descends from the sky rather than crawling up from the dirt, the illusion that a crown changes the chemistry of blood. When the crowd surges forward, dipping cloth into the warmth on the boards, they are not celebrating justice. They are collecting proof. This liquid once circulated through a body declared sacred by law and habit. Now it stains boots. The Republic shouts slogans, but the deeper victory is quieter. A god has failed a basic physics test. That failure echoes backward through time, peeling history like a carcass hung too long. To understand how a family engineered this moment for itself, one must rewind past the blade, past the speeches, past the panic, back to when power was still an emergency tool rather than a permanent lifestyle. Back to when France was not a stage, but a battlefield with no clear lines and too many graves. The land that would later host mirrors and chandeliers was once a collection of smoking fields and frightened towns. Rivers carried bodies more reliably than boats. Faith functioned less like belief and more like a weapon. The crown, at that moment, was not a symbol of divine order. It was a liability. Kings died young. Dynasties coughed themselves into extinction. The throne was less a seat than a curse that required constant feeding. Into this chaos stepped a family that understood something its rivals did not. Survival was not about being right. It was about being last. They did not arrive polished. They arrived smelling like roads and horses and meals eaten too quickly. Provincial, unfashionable, doctrinally inconvenient. A branch family with calloused hands and a talent for ducking when knives came out. While Paris perfected the art of perfumed decay, these outsiders perfected something simpler: staying alive. They watched theology turn neighbors into executioners and learned the only creed that mattered: flexibility. Not faith, not honor, flexibility. The future patriarch moved through slaughter the way a fox moves through traps. When bells rang and doors locked and Paris converted itself into a butcher shop, he did not insist on martyrdom. Martyrs decorate footnotes. Survivors inherit countries. He learned early that conviction is admirable but optional, and that a living man can renegotiate his soul as many times as necessary. This was not cynicism. It was arithmetic. Dead men do not rule. Years later, when the crown finally rolled toward him through exhaustion and assassination rather than triumph, it arrived dented and dripping. He picked it up carefully, aware that it was still hot. The capital did not want him. The faithful did not trust him. The streets did not love him. So he did what desperate surgeons do. He amputated the problem, not the people, the pretext. With a sentence that would echo like a shrug through centuries, he demonstrated the first law of Bourbon power. Sacredness is negotiable. Authority is not. The conversion was theater. Everyone knew it. That was the point. Belief had become a bureaucratic requirement, not a personal revelation. The city needed paperwork more than purity. Once the ritual was completed, the gates opened, not because anyone was convinced, but because everyone was tired. Fatigue is the most reliable ally of order. It makes compromises feel like mercy. Peace followed, not because wounds healed, but because they were bandaged tightly enough to stop bleeding in public. Edicts were signed. Enemies were bribed. Fortresses remained standing like loaded pistols on the table. The country exhaled, and in that exhale, the Bourbons tasted something intoxicating. Control. Not the raw dominance of terror, but the smoother authority of the mediator. The man who could stop the knives also decided when they came out. It worked too well. The state stabilized. Roads reopened. Fields produced something other than corpses. For the first time in decades, the crown felt useful rather than cursed. That usefulness bred confidence. Confidence bred habit. Habit hardened into doctrine. Power, once a temporary medicine, became a daily supplement. The family forgot why the dosage had been small in the first place. When the king fell to a fanatic's knife years later, bleeding out in a traffic jam, the nation mourned sincerely. The shock was not that he died, but that compromise died with him. The lesson absorbed by his heirs was not moderation, it was insulation. If accessibility killed, then distance would protect. If mercy invited blades, then ceremony would dull them. The spell would be reforged, not as shared belief, but as enforced spectacle. The next generation did not inherit chaos. They inherited a machine already humming, and machines invite upgrades. Ministers sharpen systems. Clerics filed down resistance. Local powers were dismantled like old furniture. Everything extraneous was stripped away until authority ran in a straight line from center to edge. The state became a tool that did not require persuasion, only operation, a blade with paperwork. This was the moment the spell changed form. No longer did power pretend to be merely sanctioned by heaven. It presented itself as inevitable, like gravity, like time. Disagreeing with it felt childish, almost impolite. And yet beneath the robes and seals, it remained what it had always been, a collective agreement to behave as if a family mattered more than millions of lives. That agreement would hold for generations. It would build palaces. It would choreograph nobility. It would teach Europe how to admire a performance while ignoring the invoice. But its weakness was already visible in the blood cooling on the scaffold centuries later. Belief, once converted into habit, becomes fragile. Habits can be broken, especially when hunger intervenes. The head falls because the spell was allowed to harden, because flexibility was replaced with ritual, because survival instincts were swapped for reflection worshipped in glass. The Bourbons did not invent the idea that power must be believed. They simply forgot it. And history, unimpressed, arranged a demonstration. The smell arrives before the man does. It cuts through silk and incense like an insult. Garlic, leather, damp wool, the sour residue of nights spent in the saddle. In a court that believes perfume is a moral category, this is an act of aggression. He does not glide. He does not whisper. He laughs too loudly, eats too quickly, and treats danger like bad weather. The courtiers recoil, mistaking refinement for strength and softness for safety. They are wrong on both counts. This man has learned his lessons where they are taught honestly, in mud, in flight, in rooms that lock from the outside. He comes from margins that understand how states actually fail, not with speeches, but with shortages, not with ideology, but with fear. His childhood is not a memory of tutors and tapestries, but of ambushes and negotiations conducted with one hand on a knife. He grows up watching neighbors become enemies because someone rang a bell and said God required it. He watches cities decide that purity matters more than survival. He files this away, not as trauma, but as data. Paris does not understand him because Paris has not needed to. It has been protected by walls, rituals, and the assumption that someone else will pay. In the capital, politics is a performance art. In the provinces, it is a contact sport. The future king speaks both languages, but only trusts one. He knows that crowds change opinions faster than theologians, and that hunger is more persuasive than sermons. He does not dream of ruling. He dreams of staying alive long enough to matter. When he enters the capital for the first time, it is under the pretense of peace, a wedding, a celebration, a theatrical reconciliation between faiths that have been sawing at each other's throats for a generation. On paper, it is brilliant. In reality, it is a trap baited with optimism. The city accepts the guests, counts them, and sharpens its knives. Bells ring again. Doors lock again. History repeats itself with the efficiency of a factory. This time, the future king does not rely on chance. When the killing begins, he is dragged from room to room, watching men he laughed with hours earlier become red shapes on the floor. He understands instantly that principle is about to be tested against anatomy. The choice presents itself without drama. Die correct or live compromised. He chooses the option that allows revisions. He kneels. He lies. He survives. This is not cowardice. It is strategy stripped of ornament. He understands something the martyrs never will. A dead man cannot renegotiate. For years afterward, he remains a prisoner, technically free, functionally owned, a hostage with a smile. He plays the fool deliberately. He cultivates the image of harmlessness like armor. He hunts, jokes, sleeps where he is told. He becomes background noise. Courts are good at killing threats. They are terrible at noticing jokes. Behind the performance, he builds something more durable than outrage. He builds patience. He watches dynasties age badly. He watches kings panic, hesitate, die. He watches factions eat themselves. And when the last legitimate body finally collapses under its own contradictions, the laws of inheritance point, awkwardly, at the man everyone underestimated. The crown arrives without applause. It is theoretical, contested, and unwelcome. Titles mean nothing without cities, and cities mean nothing without consent or exhaustion. He has the countryside. He has the rivers. He has soldiers who know him by name. What he does not have is Paris. Paris believes it can veto reality by starving itself heroically. He responds with siege lines and arithmetic. He waits. The city performs sanctity. Priests preach that hunger is holy. Citizens eat horses, then leather, then memory. Cemeteries become balconies of last resort. It is grotesque, but instructive. He sees clearly now. You cannot batter belief into submission. Faith resists force like a wound resists cleanliness. The walls are not the problem. The story is. So he edits the story. With the same unsentimental clarity that saved his life years earlier, he trades what is negotiable to acquire what is not. Identity yields to access. He kneels again, this time on a public stage. The ritual is obvious. Everyone understands the mechanics. The priests know. The Pope knows. He knows. The audience does not care. The performance is sufficient. Sufficient is a powerful word. It opens gates. It ends sieges. It allows everyone to pretend they were right all along. He enters the capital not as a conqueror, but as a relief shipment. Food arrives before punishments. Coin circulates before edicts. Enemies are not executed. They are purchased. It is cheaper, he explains, to pay men to stop fighting than to fund funerals. This is the founding logic of his rule. Peace is not moral. It is economical. The decree that follows is framed later as tolerance, but tolerance is too generous a word. It is fatigue formalized. After decades of bloodletting, the country signs a ceasefire with itself. Conscience is permitted. Fortresses remain. Weapons stay loaded. The compromise is not beautiful, it is functional. It stabilizes the state while embedding a future crisis inside it, like shrapnel that will surface later. For now, it works. Fields recover, roads fill. The treasury, previously an open wound, is stitched by men who hate waste more than enemies. Taxes are collected with less enthusiasm but greater consistency. Swamps are drained. Trees are planted for wars not yet fought. The king sells governance not as glory, but as dinner. A chicken promised is worth more than a sermon delivered. The people listen. Something new is born here. Not absolute power, but reciprocal expectation. The crown begins to behave as if it owes something tangible. The effect is electric. Trust, a resource rarer than gold, starts to circulate. It is imperfect and uneven, but it exists. For a moment, the distance between ruler and ruled narrows enough to permit conversation. Then a knife intervenes. In a narrow street, stalled by carts, the king is reached by a man who believes God still issues contracts for murder. The blade finds flesh. The survivor finally runs out of luck. He dies not in a palace, but in traffic, a victim of accessibility. The irony is immediate and devastating. The lesson drawn by history is not the one he taught. His death canonizes him and sterilizes his methods. Compromise becomes sentiment. Flexibility is rebranded as weakness. The men who inherit the machine do not inherit the instinct that built it. They remember the crown, they forget the mud. They keep the apparatus and discard the humility that made it viable. The dynasty survives him, but something essential does not. The understanding that power is rented, not owned. That belief is a daily maintenance task. Neglect it, and the spell hardens. Harden it long enough, and it becomes brittle. The garlic smell fades from the corridors of power. Perfume returns. Shoes redden. Distance grows. The survivor's wisdom becomes an anecdote, then a nuisance. The family keeps the kingdom, but loses the instincts that earned it. History notes the trade with a raised eyebrow and prepares the ledger. Faith, when reduced to paperwork, becomes surprisingly efficient. A signature dries. A city exhales. Bells ring for reasons other than murder. The gates open not because anyone's conscience has shifted, but because everyone has reached the same conclusion from different angles. Enough. This is how Paris is acquired. Not stormed, not redeemed, not convinced. Acquired. The transaction is vulgar in its clarity. A ritual in exchange for a capital. A wafer for a throne. The mathematics of power finally made explicit. The king understands what he has just purchased. He does not pretend otherwise. This was never about heaven. It was about access. Paris is not merely a city. It is the switchboard of France. Without it, kings shout into the countryside like prophets without followers. With it, even a compromised ruler becomes inevitable. The mass is brief. The consequences are not. What follows is not triumph, but administration. The hard, unglamorous work of turning exhaustion into order. The city expects vengeance. It receives accounting. Leaders of the rebellion are not dragged to scaffolds. They are summoned to rooms with ledgers. Titles are confirmed. Debts are forgiven selectively. Loyalty is monetized. The king does not purge Paris. He invoices it. This decision sets a precedent more dangerous than any massacre. It teaches France that peace is purchasable and that principles are negotiable under sufficient pressure. Blood had failed to unify the kingdom. Coin succeeds. The immediate effect is stability. The long-term effect is corrosion. When ideals are reduced to transactions, they do not disappear. They wait, accruing interest. The edict that follows formalizes the ceasefire. It is celebrated later as enlightened, but it is better understood as triage. Conscience is acknowledged, not respected. Worship is tolerated, not embraced. Fortresses remain. Militias stay armed. The state permits a minority to exist while holding a knife behind its back. This is not harmony. It is suspended violence. The brilliance of the move lies in its honesty. The king does not demand trust. He offers insurance. He tells his former enemies to keep their walls, their guns, their exit plans. He understands that trust forced too quickly turns feral. Better to acknowledge fear and regulate it than to pretend it has vanished. The kingdom breathes again, shallow but steady. Economically, the strategy borders on genius. The crown stops burning money on corpses and starts investing in productivity. Roads are repaired so armies and grain can move with equal efficiency. Swamps are drained not for beauty, but for calories. Trees are planted with future wars in mind. The state begins to think in decades rather than seasons. This is the moment France stops merely surviving and starts recovering. The king sells this recovery with imagery simple enough to bypass ideology. He does not speak of sovereignty or divine mandate. He speaks of dinner, of pots that should contain something other than water. It is a low bar, deliberately set. He understands his audience. Hungry people do not want abstractions. They want evidence. A chicken boiling on a Sunday afternoon becomes proof of governance. For a brief window, the monarchy feels useful again. Not sacred, useful. The people do not love the crown. They accept it. Acceptance is underrated. It lacks poetry, but produces stability. The relationship between ruler and ruled becomes transactional rather than mystical. Taxes are resented but paid. Laws are questioned but obeyed. The machine hums. Yet embedded within this compromise is a flaw so obvious it will later be called tragic rather than negligent. By allowing a state within the state, the crown postpones rather than resolves the question of authority. The fortresses permitted to the minority become symbols, not of protection, but of conditional loyalty. Everyone knows this arrangement cannot last. The question is not if it will end, but who will end it, and how violently. The king seems aware of this, but he is managing probabilities, not destinies. His task is not to perfect France. It is to prevent it from killing itself on schedule. In that he succeeds. When he is murdered years later, the country mourns not because he was flawless, but because he was functional. Functionality becomes nostalgic very quickly. His death rewrites the meaning of his compromises. What were once pragmatic decisions are reframed as indulgences. What were once stabilizing bribes are recast as weakness. The successors inherit peace without understanding its construction. They see the walls but not the scaffolding. They assume the kingdom is unified because it has been quiet. Quiet is deceptive. Beneath the surface, resentments ferment. Catholics remember the humiliation of toleration. Protestants remember the fragility of permission. Nobles resent the crown's intrusion into their privileges. Peasants resent the crown's continued appetite for taxes. Everyone resents everyone else in private. The ceasefire holds because no one wants to be the first to light the match again. The institutional memory of compromise fades faster than the institutions themselves. Ministers trained under survival logic are replaced by men trained in ceremony. The crown, having learned it can buy loyalty, forgets that prices change. Inflation affects allegiance too. What once cost a purse of silver later requires a palace. The phrase about Paris becomes legend, repeated with a laugh that misses the warning inside it. It is remembered as cleverness, not desperation. A punchline, not a confession. The monarchy internalizes the wrong lesson. It learns that belief is optional, but does not learn that legitimacy still requires maintenance. It mistakes a successful shortcut for a permanent road. This misunderstanding metastasizes over generations. The crown grows more confident in its ability to substitute performance for connection. Ritual replaces negotiation. Etiquette replaces listening. The state becomes convinced it can manufacture obedience indefinitely through spectacle and distribution. The transaction that once saved it becomes habit. Habit becomes entitlement. The compromise that opened Paris also opens the door to absolutism. Not immediately, not obviously, but once authority is centralized to manage peace, it is tempting to keep it centralized to manage everything else. The crown begins to prefer solutions that do not require conversation. Uniformity feels safer than balance. Control feels cleaner than negotiation. In retrospect, the mass was not the scandal. The aftermath was. By proving that faith could be exchanged for access, the monarchy taught itself that nothing was truly sacred, not belief, not custom, not even its own limits. That realization, once internalized, demands escalation. If everything is negotiable, why negotiate at all when command is faster? The city that opened its gates out of exhaustion will one day open its squares for executions. The logic is consistent. When power presents itself as a series of transactions, the final transaction is blood. The Bourbons do not see this yet. They are still enjoying the quiet. The ledgers balance, the roads fill, the kingdom functions. But the price of Paris has not been fully paid. It has only been deferred. History, meticulous and patient, records the debt without comment and waits for compound interest to do its work. The knife arrives without ceremony. No prophecy. No thunder. Just a man in traffic, sweating in an open carriage, irritated by delays and convinced briefly that the city loves him enough to be harmless. The blade does not come from an enemy army or a rival dynasty. It comes from belief unmedicated by exhaustion. A lone fanatic steps forward, convinced the king has broken a contract with heaven. The strike is intimate, clumsy, final. Blood spills onto upholstery. The survivor of sieges, massacres, and negotiations dies because he chose accessibility over armor. This is not merely an assassination, it is a referendum, and the verdict is immediate. The nation mourns, sincerely and loudly, but power listens for different signals. What it hears is not grief, it hears vulnerability. The lesson absorbed by the state is brutally simple. Mercy invites proximity. Proximity invites knives. Therefore, mercy is inefficient. The death of the king does not just remove a man, it removes a philosophy. Compromise, once the operating system of survival, is quietly archived as a dangerous experiment. Tolerance becomes a risk factor. Flexibility is rebranded as indecision. The instinct that once saved France from itself is recast as a liability that got a king killed in broad daylight behind a hay wagon. The crown passes to a child. The country passes to guardians who draw the wrong conclusion from the blood on the street. They do not ask how the king ruled. They ask how he died. And they decide that softness was the cause. This is how mercy ends. Not with an argument, but with a cautionary tale repeated until it hardens into doctrine. The next regime does not immediately announce a turn toward cruelty. It announces order. Order sounds clean. Order sounds adult. Order promises that nothing unpredictable will ever happen again. Ministers sharpen systems. Clerics polish theology into law. Fortresses once tolerated are now targeted. The state stops negotiating with differences and starts managing them with pressure. The justification is always the same. Unity. A word flexible enough to mean whatever power requires at the moment. Unity demands that dissent be regulated. Unity demands that exceptions be temporary. Unity demands that the center decide what the edges are allowed to be. The machinery of compromise is dismantled piece by piece and replaced with something more efficient and far less forgiving. Where the dead king had balanced factions, like unstable chemicals, his successors prefer containment. Dialogue is replaced by decrees. Guarantees are replaced by inspections. The minority that once held keys to its own fortresses now feels the weight of the state's curiosity. The ceasefire signed in exhaustion begins to look like an embarrassment that needs correcting. The rhetoric changes first. Tolerance is no longer framed as wisdom, but as indulgence. Past concessions are described as necessary evils rather than strategic successes. The narrative is revised. Peace was not achieved through negotiation. It was delayed by it. The implication is clear. True peace requires submission. This shift does not produce immediate bloodshed. It produces something more corrosive. Distrust. The minority remembers promises that are now described as mistakes. The majority is told that patience has gone on long enough. Both sides begin to stockpile grievance. The state, meanwhile, congratulates itself on finally being decisive. The irony is exquisite. In attempting to prevent another knife, the monarchy begins sharpening its own. The security apparatus expands. Surveillance grows. Informants multiply. Loyalty is tested not by actions, but by conformity. The crown learns to see threats everywhere because threats are useful. They justify expansion. They excuse severity. This is the moment mercy truly dies. Not because kindness vanishes, but because it is no longer allowed to shape policy. Compassion becomes a private virtue at best and a political flaw at worst. The state adopts a colder posture, believing it has learned from experience. It has, just not the right lesson. The child king grows up inside this recalibrated system. He does not remember compromise. He remembers fear. He inherits a state that has already decided control is safer than trust. Advisors surround him with diagrams of power that resemble fortresses rather than networks. The message is consistent. Authority must never again depend on affection. What follows is not tyranny yet. It is preparation, the flattening of obstacles, the removal of intermediaries, the centralization of decision-making. The state learns to speak with one voice because multiple voices sound like weakness. Local powers are trimmed. Privileges are audited. The crown's reach extends quietly but relentlessly into places once governed by custom rather than command. The justification always returns to the knife. Remember what happens when the king walks among the people. Remember what happens when belief is allowed to coexist. Remember the blood on the carriage floor. Memory becomes a weapon. It is used to silence dissent and to frame severity as prudence. Religion, once a battlefield of factions, is recast as an instrument of cohesion. Diversity of belief is tolerated less as a reality and more as a problem awaiting resolution. The state does not yet abolish differences. It catalogs them. Lists are made. Boundaries drawn. The idea that a kingdom might survive by managing plurality is replaced with the conviction that plurality itself is the threat. This transformation is gradual enough to feel reasonable. Each step appears corrective rather than revolutionary. Each measure is justified as temporary. Each restriction is framed as necessary. And because the alternative is chaos, few object loudly. Those who do are reminded of the knife, of the danger of leniency, of the price of mercy. The memory of the murdered king becomes mythologized. He is remembered as good, beloved, tragic, but his methods are quietly discarded. He becomes a saint whose gospel is no longer preached. The institution that benefited from his pragmatism now treats it as an anomaly. In this environment, the monarchy begins to harden. It stops asking what the country needs and starts deciding what it will accept. The difference is subtle but fatal. Needs require listening. Acceptance requires enforcement. The state chooses the latter because it feels more controllable. This is the true turning point. Not a coronation, not a war, not a decree, but a psychological shift within power itself. Mercy is no longer a tool. It is a risk, and risks are to be eliminated. The crown does not yet realize that by eliminating mercy, it is also eliminating adaptability. The ability to bend is replaced by the insistence on standing rigid. This works beautifully in calm weather. It fails catastrophically in storms. For now, the kingdom appears stronger, quieter, more predictable. The knives retreat from the streets, but they do not disappear. They wait, patient, as beliefs once did, accumulating pressure beneath a surface polished to a mirror shine. The knife that killed one king does not end violence. It ends humility. And without humility, power begins its long, confident march toward a fall it can no longer imagine. Axes are efficient tools. They do not negotiate. They do not persuade. They reduce problems to surfaces and angles. Long before a crown begins to glow, before mirrors are polished and rituals rehearsed, the axes come out. Quietly, methodically. This is the phase of the story that never makes it into portraits. No crowns, no sunlight, just paperwork sharpened until it cuts. The kingdom inherited by the child king is still scarred, still suspicious of itself. Peace exists, but it is conditional. Memory is fresh. Factions have not forgotten where they hid their weapons. The state, having decided that mercy is dangerous, now searches for something sturdier. It finds administration, not the romantic administration of laws and ideals, but the mechanical kind. Lists, audits, jurisdictions tighten like knots. This is where the clerics and ministers matter more than the monarch. The throne is occupied by a boy. Power is exercised by men who believe chaos can be cured by compression. They look at France and see inefficiency everywhere. Independent nobles, semi-autonomous cities, religious enclaves with private walls. To them, this is not diversity. It is structural weakness. And weakness, as the knife proved, gets kings killed. So they begin to flatten the landscape. Castles that once symbolized feudal pride are dismantled stone by stone, not in dramatic sieges, but by decree. Walls come down under legal language so dense it suffocates resistance. The nobility, once predators roaming their territories, are clipped. Their private armies dissolve. Their judicial privileges evaporate. In exchange, they are offered proximity, court access, titles without teeth. It feels like advancement. It is domestication. Religious strongholds fare no better. The fortified towns granted under the old compromise are now framed as anomalies. The state asks why any citizen should be armed against the crown. The answer is obvious, but unacceptable. So sieges return, cleaner this time, justified not by theology but by uniformity. Hunger is applied with surgical patience. Cities surrender not because they are defeated, but because they are isolated. The axe falls without swinging. Intelligence networks bloom. Spies replace scouts. Information becomes the new weapon. The crown learns who speaks to whom, who doubts quietly, who remembers old promises too vividly. Surveillance is not presented as oppression, it is presented as prudence. The language is always protective, for the good of the realm, to prevent disorder, to ensure peace. The clerical mind excels at this. Theology has always been about defining boundaries. Orthodoxy and heresy, inside and outside. Applied to governance, it produces something chillingly effective, a moral geometry where deviation is sin and correction is salvation. The state begins to moralize obedience. Loyalty is no longer merely expected. It is virtuous. By the time the king grows old enough to understand the machine he has inherited, it no longer resembles the fragile compromise that stabilized France years earlier. It is sleek, centralized, confident. Orders flow outward without friction. Resistance, when it appears, feels almost rude. The kingdom has been reorganized to reduce dissent not by persuasion, but by exhaustion. This is the paradox. In trying to prevent chaos, the state removes the mechanisms that once absorbed it. There are fewer valves, fewer intermediaries, fewer places for pressure to leak harmlessly. Everything routes back to the center. This feels powerful. It also means that when something breaks, it breaks everywhere. The boy king learns to trust the system because it works. Taxes arrive, armies mobilize, laws are enforced. He does not see the cost because the cost is distributed among people he will never meet. Distance is framed as dignity. Insulation becomes synonymous with safety. He grows up believing that authority is something you occupy, not something you negotiate. The ministers encourage this belief. They have no interest in another accessible king. They remember the carriage. They remember the knife. They design routines to prevent vulnerability. Protocols multiply. Audiences become choreographed. Physical proximity is regulated. The monarch is no longer a man among subjects. He is a node in a system, protected by layers of ceremony and distance. This transformation feels like maturity. The messy improvisation of the previous reign is replaced with discipline. The crown stops bending and starts imposing. The people notice, but quietly. The memory of war is still close enough to make obedience preferable to uncertainty. Silence is mistaken for consent. The administrative state begins to see itself as permanent, not a response to crisis, but the natural order. It rewrites history to support this view. Past compromises are recast as temporary aberrations. The narrative becomes cleaner. France was always meant to be unified. Authority was always meant to be centralized. Dissent was always an infection. In this environment, a new idea takes root. If control prevents knives, then absolute control must prevent everything else. This idea is seductive. It promises safety without negotiation, order without compromise. It whispers that if the crown simply becomes large enough, bright enough, distant enough, no one will dare reach for it. But before brightness comes something duller. Bureaucracy, the daily grind of forms, councils, signatures. Power is no longer personal. It is procedural. Decisions are justified by precedent rather than empathy. This is how cruelty becomes impersonal. No one feels responsible because everyone is authorized. The king, watching this apparatus function, learns a dangerous lesson. The state does not need affection, it needs compliance. Love is unpredictable, awe is reliable, and awe can be manufactured. Not yet, but soon. The axes have done their work. The landscape is leveled. The old feudal chaos is gone. In its place stands a platform, flat, wide, perfect for spectacle. The stage is set for something new, something radiant, something that will convince everyone that this machinery is not merely necessary, but glorious. The irony is that this preparation is invisible to those who benefit from it. The nobility, now stripped of real power, will soon be compensated with rituals. The people, now accustomed to obedience, will soon be dazzled with imagery. The state, having eliminated competitors, will soon eliminate limits. No one calls it absolutism yet. It does not need a name while it is being assembled. It is simply order refined to its logical conclusion. The axe clears the forest so the sun can shine without obstruction. When the light finally appears, it will look like destiny. Few will remember the chopping that made it possible. Fewer still will notice that the same tools used to remove obstacles can just as easily remove heads. For now, the kingdom stands quiet, symmetrical, obedient. The machine hums. The boy watches, And somewhere deep inside the structure, mercy finishes bleeding out, unnoticed, as the last splintered walls collapse. Fear does not announce itself as fear. It arrives disguised as vigilance, as memory, as a reasonable response to disorder. The boy learns this early, not from books, but from footsteps echoing down corridors that should have been secure. He is too young to understand politics, but old enough to understand invasion. The palace doors do not stop the noise. Shouts leak through stone. Boots scrape floors meant for ceremony. Authority, he learns, can be reached. And what can be reached can be touched. He lies still in his bed as instructed, breathing shallowly, practicing invisibility. A crowd floods the room, not assassins. Worse, citizens, curious, loud, careless with proximity. They do not come to kill him. They come to see if he is real. Torches hover above his face. Fingers point. Laughter mixes with wine. The king is inspected like livestock. He does not move. He does not cry. He memorizes. This moment imprints itself deeper than any coronation ever will. Fear does not feel dramatic to him. It feels instructional. It teaches him that walls are decorative, that loyalty is conditional, that nobility panics as easily as mobs, and most importantly, that the capital is not a heart. It is a mouth. It devours weakness and demands spectacle in return. When the crowd finally leaves, the room smells different. Sweat, smoke, something feral. The boy survives the night, but something else does not. The assumption that kings are untouchable. From this point forward, safety becomes an obsession disguised as philosophy. He does not vow revenge. He vows insulation. As he grows, fear matures with him. It refines itself. It becomes policy. He watches the nobles who failed to protect him maneuver for advantage. He notices how quickly loyalty changes costumes, how yesterday's defender becomes today's accuser. The lesson is clear. Dependence is dangerous. Control is cleaner. By the time he is old enough to rule in name, the state has already been shaped around this insight. Ministers speak softly about stability. Advisors recommend distance. The apparatus built during his childhood rewards remoteness and punishes accessibility. The boy absorbs this logic without resistance because it aligns perfectly with his trauma. Power, he decides, must never again be visible enough to be questioned. He studies ritual not for beauty, but for function. Ceremony creates hierarchy. Hierarchy creates predictability. Predictability reduces surprise. Surprise is where fear lives. He begins to see governance not as leadership, but as choreography. Everyone has a place. Everyone moves on cue. Improvisation is the enemy. The capital, with its narrow streets and loud opinions, disgusts him. It smells like danger. He associates it with humiliation and noise. He prefers spaces that can be controlled, landscapes that can be reshaped, rooms where entry is permission, not accident. The idea of retreat does not feel like avoidance. It feels like strategy. As adulthood approaches, he watches his regents rule. He notes their mistakes, their compromises, their flirtations with popularity. He sees how quickly authority leaks when shared. The lesson crystallizes. Power cannot be delegated safely. It must be embodied, centralized, singular. A crown worn lightly invites hands. When the moment finally arrives and the machinery of guardianship shuts down, the court expects continuity. Another minister, another favorite, another layer of insulation between king and consequence. They misread him. The fear they planted has grown teeth. He announces calmly that he will rule alone. No intermediary, no buffer. This is not bravado. It is prophylaxis. If power is going to fail, It will fail in his hands, not through someone else's incompetence. The court freezes. The implications ripple outward. The boy who once lay still beneath torches has learned how to make rooms go silent. From this point on, everything he builds traces back to that night. The architecture of his reign mirrors the architecture of his fear: long sight lines, controlled access, central positioning. He does not merely want authority, he wants perspective, to see everything before it moves, to be the only fixed point in a shifting room. He surrounds himself not with rivals, but with dependents, men whose status evaporates without him, lawyers instead of warlords, administrators instead of heroes. They are easier to manage, easier to fire, easier to erase. Nobility, once a threat, is converted into decoration. The rituals intensify. Daily routines become sacred theater. Watching him dress becomes an honor. Touching his sleeve becomes a career milestone. The absurdity is deliberate. It keeps everyone busy, focused inward, distracted from substance. The court begins to orbit him not because he commands it, but because he structures reality that way. Fear at this stage is no longer visible. It has been sublimated into magnificence. The frightened child is buried under wigs and titles and distance. But he still makes decisions like someone who remembers the smell of a mob. He never forgives Paris. He never trusts it. He chooses a site away from its reach, a place where approach can be measured, controlled, announced. The new palace rises not as a residence, but as a solution. Distance turned into beauty. Security disguised as art. The court follows because exclusion is terrifying. To be absent is to be irrelevant. And irrelevance in this system is a form of death. The boy's fear infects the state, but it does so productively. Order increases. Resistance decreases. The machine runs smoother than ever. From the outside, it looks like strength. From the inside, it feels like inevitability. No one questions the design because the design delivers results. Yet fear is a poor long-term architect. It overbuilds. It hardens structures that need flexibility. It prioritizes control over resilience. The king does not notice this because the system is finally doing what it was designed to do: protect him. The people, meanwhile, recede into abstraction. They become numbers, categories, distant sounds beyond gardens. Their problems arrive, filtered through reports and rituals. Hunger does not breach marble. Anger does not echo in mirrored halls. The king feels safe, and because he feels safe, he believes the country must be as well. The boy who learned fear has now taught it to a nation. He has converted trauma into doctrine. The state reflects his inner architecture: grand, ordered, distant, immaculate. It appears invincible, but it is brittle in a way only fear can engineer. For now, the transformation is complete. The frightened child has become the axis around which everything turns. The crowd will never again enter his bedroom. The price of that safety will be paid later, by people who will never see his face close enough to recognize it as human. The sun has not yet risen, but the sky has been cleared. And fear, patient and meticulous, has prepared a stage where control can finally shine without interruption. The palace does not rise from the ground so much as impose itself upon it. Marshland is drained. Rivers are bullied into obedience. Forests are uprooted and replanted, as if time itself can be reordered with enough money and labor. What emerges is not a home. It is an argument made of stone, a declaration that nature, like people, will comply if pressured correctly. Versailles is conceived as a solution to a problem that cannot be named aloud. The problem is proximity. The king does not want rivals near his throat. He wants them where he can see them, count them, exhaust them. He wants danger converted into decor. So he builds a place so magnificent that refusing to live there feels like rebellion. Attendance becomes loyalty. Absence becomes suspicion. The court arrives willingly, even eagerly. Dukes and princes trade ancestral castles for rooms that barely fit their egos. They tell themselves this is advancement. In truth, it is relocation into captivity with better lighting. The king does not confiscate their power. He makes it irrelevant. A noble who spends his days choosing lace and rehearsing bows has no time to raise armies. A man drowning in etiquette cannot sharpen knives. Versailles runs on ritual the way factories run on coal. Every gesture is codified, every movement ranked. Who may enter the bedroom? Who may hand over a shirt? Who may hold a candlestick while the king changes? These are not eccentricities. They are instruments. Status becomes granular, competitive, addictive. Ambition is redirected away from governance and toward proximity. The nobles learn quickly. Advancement no longer comes from competence or courage. It comes from visibility, from being seen at the right moment, in the right outfit, performing the right deference. The king becomes the sole source of oxygen. To breathe, you orbit him. To fall out of orbit is to suffocate socially. Debt does the rest. Fashion changes constantly, by design. What was acceptable last season is humiliating now. Estates are mortgaged to keep up. Lands are sold to pay tailors. Creditors circle. And who controls the money supply? The crown. Dependence becomes structural. The wolves are not caged by force. They are bankrupted into obedience. The Hall of Mirrors sits at the center like a loaded cymbal. Light fractures endlessly across glass, multiplying the king into infinity. Ambassadors walk its length, disoriented, overwhelmed by scale and reflection. This is diplomacy by vertigo. By the time negotiations begin, the visitor already understands the hierarchy. He is small. The king is everywhere. But Versailles is not only for foreigners. It is primarily for the French nobility. It teaches them to see themselves as reflections rather than actors. Their worth is measured by how well they shine in borrowed light. They gossip. They intrigue. They destroy each other over slights so minor they would be laughable anywhere else. This is intentional. Horizontal conflict prevents vertical challenge. Behind the mirrors, reality decays. The palace stinks. There are too many people and too few places to dispose of waste. Hallways double as latrines. Gardens hide filth beneath geometry. Perfume becomes necessity, not luxury. Wigs cover shaved heads infested with lice. Silk floats above sewage. This contradiction is the dynasty in miniature. Splendor layered over rot, held together by habit and denial. The king thrives in this environment because it matches his internal architecture. Distance, control, surveillance disguised as ceremony. He knows who is where, who spoke to whom, who wore what. Information flows upward faster than truth flows outward. Reports replace voices, numbers replace faces. The people exist as a concept beyond the gates. Versailles achieves its immediate purpose flawlessly. The nobility is neutralized. Rebellions cease. The state hums with precision. From the outside, France looks unstoppable. Culturally dominant, politically unified, militarily confident. Other courts imitate the fashion, the language, the manners. Power now exports aesthetics instead of armies. This success conceals its cost. By pulling the elite away from their lands, the king severs the last thread connecting them to local reality. They no longer know their tenants. They no longer see bad harvests. They no longer hear anger forming. Their world shrinks to corridors and ceremonies. When they think of France, they think of chandeliers. The king mistakes silence for loyalty. He sees obedience and assumes consent. He does not notice that resentment grows best when ignored. Versailles manufactures admiration, but also breeds contempt. The distance that protects the monarch also insulates him from warning signs. The palace becomes a universe with its own gravity. Everything revolves around the king, but nothing escapes. Innovation slows. Risk aversion sets in. No one wants to be the bearer of bad news. Reports soften reality before it reaches the throne. Hunger becomes an abstract problem solvable on paper. Taxes are adjusted. Nothing feels urgent. The golden cage functions perfectly until it doesn't. Its rigidity is its weakness. It cannot adapt quickly because adaptation requires listening. Listening requires proximity. Proximity is what the palace was built to eliminate. Versailles turns power into theater so convincing that even the actors believe it. The king begins to confuse performance with permanence. The nobles confuse privilege with security. The state confuses order with health. Beneath the marble, pressures accumulate. The irony is that Versailles was meant to prevent knives. It does. No blade reaches the king here, but it also ensures that when violence returns, it will not be personal. It will be systemic, not aimed at one man, but at the entire structure that made him unreachable. The palace trains a generation of elites to live inside illusion. When reality finally intrudes, they will have no language for it. They will respond with etiquette to hunger, with protocol to rage. The people outside the gates will not be impressed. Versailles is remembered as beauty. It should be remembered as engineering. A machine designed to convert fear into magnificence and rivals into furniture. It succeeds beyond expectation. And in doing so, it ensures that when belief finally collapses, there will be nothing soft left to catch the fall. The cage glitters. The occupants preen. The king feels safe at last. Beyond the gardens, the country continues to exist, increasingly unseen, increasingly unheard. History watches the distance widen and notes, without comment, that cages work best right up until the moment they don't. The machine built to enforce peace quickly discovers it prefers motion. Stillness feels like weakness. Order demands justification, and nothing justifies power like war. Once internal enemies are neutralized and rivals reduced to ornaments, the state looks outward, restless, bored, offended by borders that imply limitation. War becomes identity, not strategy, not necessity, identity. The king does not merely wage war, he inhabits it. Campaigns are staged like ballets. Sieges become spectacles. Victories are painted before they are finished. Even defeats are dressed as inconveniences. The court absorbs war as entertainment, filtered through reports that highlight glory and suppress cost. Blood never reaches Versailles. It is converted into numbers long before it touches marble. At first, it works. The army is professionalized. Logistics improve. Fortresses rise like geometric scars along the borders, elegant, efficient, terrifying. France grows into the shape the king believes it deserves. Neighbors retreat. Diplomats flatter. Europe recalibrates around French confidence. The monarch's sense of destiny feels confirmed, but identity addiction is never satisfied. Each success dulls the previous high. A new war is required to maintain the feeling of inevitability. Peace becomes uncomfortable. Peace invites reflection. Reflection invites doubt. So the wars multiply. Some are framed as legal disputes, others as defensive necessities. A few are nakedly personal. A dowry unpaid. An insult remembered. A republic thriving without a king. The reasons blur, but the motion continues. The army marches because the crown needs to feel itself moving. The costs are manageable at first, then they aren't. Taxes rise incrementally, quietly. New levies appear with reassuring names. Farmers notice. Merchants adapt. The system still holds. The machine absorbs strain, by squeezing those least able to complain. Victory papers over cracks. Each triumph convinces the court that the model is sound. The king believes his own mythology. The nobles cheer because cheering is safer than questioning. Ministers massage figures to preserve momentum. The illusion of control survives by consuming reality. Then the wars change character. Coalitions form. Enemies stop fighting alone. They study France, copy its methods, and improve them. The machine meets mirrors that reflect its own techniques back at it. The victories slow. The battles stretch. Supply lines fray. Winter arrives without permission. The treasury begins to empty faster than it can be refilled. Gold melts into gunpowder. Silver becomes salaries. Even furniture is not safe. Objects once meant to impress ambassadors are sacrificed to feed armies that no longer guarantee success. At ground level, the relationship between war and hunger becomes intimate. Soldiers requisition grain. Villages comply until they cannot. Harvests fail. Winters bite. Bread prices rise. The people notice that glory tastes like ash. Inside Versailles, the response is procedural. Councils convene. Figures are reviewed. Adjustments proposed. No one suggests stopping. War has become structural. To halt it would be to admit that the entire identity of the reign was a choice, not a destiny. The king ages with the wars. His body stiffens. His energy narrows. Advisors filter reality more aggressively, fearing displeasure. News arrives late and softened. Catastrophes are reframed as temporary setbacks. The distance between command and consequence widens. Then comes the decision that exposes the addiction completely. Purity, not victory, not security. Purity. The crown decides unity must be absolute. One law, one faith, one will. Diversity is rebranded as weakness. Compromise is recast as moral failure. The king convinces himself that cleansing the realm will stabilize it. The irony goes unnoticed. The revocation is signed. Soldiers are unleashed not on foreign enemies, but on homes. Families are harassed, terrorized, broken until they submit or flee. The state congratulates itself on restoring order. The numbers look impressive. Conversions spike, reports glow. What disappears is not immediately visible. Skills leave quietly. Capital follows. Networks dissolve. Industries wither without explanation. Competitors abroad grow stronger using talent France discarded in the name of righteousness. This is not a sudden collapse. It is erosion, the kind that looks harmless until foundations give way. The wars continue, now heavier, more desperate. Enemies are better funded, better supplied, and increasingly coordinated. France fights on multiple fronts, driven less by ambition than by inertia. Retreat feels impossible. Victory feels necessary even when unattainable. By the end, the machine is exhausted. The army is stretched. The people are hungry. The treasury is hollow. The court is insulated by habit. They still dress magnificently. They still perform ritual. They still believe this is what power looks like. The king finally senses the cost, but too late. He speaks of peace in private, regret in whispers. His final advice is restraint delivered to heirs raised inside excess. The confession lands without force because it arrives after the damage is done. When death takes him, it does not feel like tragedy. It feels like relief. The nation exhales. The wars stop briefly, not out of wisdom, but because there is nothing left to spend. What remains is a state trained to define itself through dominance, but no longer capable of sustaining it. A population conditioned to sacrifice without reward. An elite addicted to ceremony and incapable of reform. The wars did not destroy France. They hollowed it. Identity built on perpetual conflict cannot survive peace, and a state that forgets how to be ordinary will eventually be forced to relearn it violently. The machine rolls on, slower now, louder, creaking under debts it cannot explain to those who must pay them. War once made the crown feel eternal. Now it has taught the country a dangerous lesson. Power that must constantly prove itself is already afraid. The decision is framed as moral housekeeping, an overdue cleaning, a final alignment of heaven and state. The language is careful, ceremonial, almost gentle. What follows is neither gentle nor careful. It is administrative violence carried out with clean hands and holy justification. Purity is marketed as strength. Difference is redefined as rot. The state announces that unity requires uniformity and that conscience is a negotiable inconvenience. Soldiers are not sent to borders. They are sent to living rooms. Boots do not cross frontiers. They cross thresholds. The policy is efficient, terrifyingly so. Homes are occupied. Families are pressured. Conversion is encouraged with noise, humiliation, and exhaustion. The violence is calibrated. Enough to break spirits, not enough to create martyrs. The bureaucracy congratulates itself on restraint. On paper, it works. Numbers climb, reports glow. The realm appears cleansed. The king sleeps easier, believing he has purchased salvation for his people and himself. The court applauds, because applause is safer than objection. What the paperwork does not measure is movement. People leave. Quietly. At night. Carrying skills rather than banners. They do not rebel. They relocate. The state notices only after absence becomes pattern. These are not peasants fleeing hunger. They are craftsmen, financiers, engineers, merchants, the connective tissue of the economy, the people who turn raw materials into wealth and taxes into systems. Their departure does not cause immediate collapse. It causes lag. Workshops empty. Techniques vanish. Credit tightens. Trade networks reroute. Foreign competitors absorb talent like sponges. Cities across borders swell with expertise. France paid to educate and then expelled. The irony is surgical. The policy meant to strengthen the state strengthens its rivals instead. Enemy treasuries fill with French knowledge. Enemy industries bloom with French hands. Enemy armies march wearing uniforms funded by skills France rejected. Inside the kingdom, explanations multiply. Blame is assigned to weather, to markets, to fate. The real cause is ideologically inconvenient and therefore ignored. Purity has become too expensive to abandon. Admitting error would collapse the moral architecture of the reign. The state responds the only way it knows how. More control, more taxation, more pressure. The remaining population absorbs the cost left by those who escaped it. Resentment grows, invisible at first, then audible. Meanwhile, the king grows older. His certainty hardens. Advisors learn not to mention the missing artisans or the vanishing revenue. Silence becomes policy. Versailles remains luminous, insulated by routine and denial. The cultural consequences are immediate but misread. Intellectual life narrows. Innovation slows. Risk-taking feels dangerous in a climate that punishes difference. The arts continue but feel repetitive, ornamental. Style survives substance. Foreign observers notice. Admiration shifts to mimicry. France no longer leads, it performs. The language of refinement persists while the engine sputters. Purity proves addictive. Each perceived threat invites a crackdown. Each crackdown shrinks the pool of loyalty. The state begins to confuse obedience with belief. People comply outwardly and detach inwardly. Faith becomes performative. Cynicism spreads. The economy adjusts downward. The Treasury relies increasingly on borrowing. Paper promises stack atop one another like fragile scaffolding. Confidence holds only because no alternative has yet appeared credible. The king dies, convinced he preserved unity. History notes that he preserved appearance. The difference matters. His successors inherit a kingdom, outwardly intact and inwardly depleted. The talent drain cannot be reversed quickly. Trust, once broken, does not regenerate on command. The machine continues to function, but with missing parts. The irony sharpens. The centralized state built to enforce order becomes incapable of self-correction. Dissent is equated with treason. Feedback loops collapse. Policy floats unchallenged until reality intervenes violently. The people feel the consequences long before they understand the causes. Bread becomes expensive. Work becomes scarce. Taxes feel arbitrary. Explanations feel insulting. The state speaks of morality while collecting more money from fewer hands. Purity has achieved what foreign armies failed to do. It has weakened the realm from within while convincing its architects they were virtuous. The lesson is ancient and routinely ignored. States do not starve because they lack land or armies. They starve because they exile usefulness in the name of correctness. Ideology cannot replace competence. Faith cannot replace skill. Obedience cannot replace productivity. By the time this becomes obvious, reversing course would require humility. Humility is the one resource the system never stockpiled. So the machine presses on, louder now, demanding more loyalty from fewer believers. It calls this stability. History calls it late-stage confidence. The kingdom remains impressive to visitors. Palaces still gleam. Ceremonies still impress. But behind the mirrors, the balance sheets are thin. The workshops are quieter. The future is already living somewhere else. Purity did not save the empire. It quietly exported its best parts and left the rest to carry the weight. When collapse finally arrives, it will be blamed on everything except the policy that made it inevitable. The air smells expensive. That is the first clue. When a system begins to rot, it does not announce itself with smoke or noise. It covers the smell. It perfumes decay until even the people inside forget what clean air feels like. The court glides forward on routine. The rituals continue because stopping them would require noticing what they have replaced. Days are filled with entertainment, engineered to prevent boredom from turning into thought. Music softens silence. Gossip fills gaps where policy should be. Style becomes substance by default. The king remains central, but his presence is thinner now. He is there physically, increasingly absent mentally. Power continues to orbit him, but he no longer pulls. He drifts. Decisions are delayed. Files stack. Ministers learn to operate without direction, advancing their own interests while pretending to serve his. Boredom settles in like a permanent climate. Not the boredom of idleness, but of meaninglessness. Absolute power without purpose hollows its owner. The crown feels less like destiny and more like a job with no exit and no reward. The king retreats inward. The state notices too late. Into this vacuum step intermediaries, favorites, companions, intimates. They are labeled frivolous because it is easier than admitting they govern. Influence shifts from council chambers to bedrooms. Access becomes authority. Proximity replaces competence. The court adjusts seamlessly. It always does. New rules are learned quickly when survival depends on them. Flattery sharpens. Intrigue becomes professionalized. The political class retools itself around personal influence rather than institutional responsibility. This does not look like collapse. It looks like decadence. And decadence is misleading because it feels stable. Everyone is fed. Everyone is dressed. The lights stay on. From the inside, the system feels eternal. Outside, the picture is different. Bread prices fluctuate upward. Wages stagnate. Local officials squeeze harder to meet fiscal demands passed down without explanation. The people begin to feel managed rather than ruled. They are no longer addressed as subjects with obligations and protections. They are revenue streams. The cultural output of the era reflects this dissonance. Art becomes light, ornamental, escapist. Pastoral fantasies fill walls and salons. Shepherdesses with clean hands and silk dresses populate canvases while real farmers struggle. This is not hypocrisy. It is insulation. A society choosing not to see itself. Satire creeps in where reverence once ruled. Pamphlets circulate. Whispered jokes gain edge. The king's body, once sacred, becomes material for rumor. His habits are mocked. His companions caricatured. The shift is subtle but irreversible. Awe erodes first. Respect follows. The state still functions, but belief has thinned. People comply because they must, not because they accept. Obedience becomes transactional. Loyalty becomes conditional. The social contract is no longer spoken of. It is assumed, broken, and tolerated. Foreign policy accelerates the rot. Defeats abroad puncture prestige at home. Losses once framed as strategic recalibrations become undeniable humiliations. Colonies vanish, fleets sink, rivals grow rich. The narrative of inevitability fractures. The public notices patterns. Taxes rise after failures. Celebrations continue after losses. The court appears disconnected, rehearsing elegance, while the country absorbs consequences. This perception matters more than truth. Politics runs on impressions long before facts. The king senses hostility, but misreads it. He assumes ingratitude where there is despair. He sees disrespect where there is disillusionment. The distance created by Versailles now becomes informational blindness. Feedback arrives late and distorted. Attempts at reform flicker and fail. Each proposal threatens entrenched interests. Each resistance is polite, procedural, and fatal. The system is optimized to prevent change. It interprets urgency as impropriety. Meanwhile, money becomes abstract. Borrowing increases. Complex financial instruments promise relief without sacrifice. They work briefly, just long enough to defer reckoning. Confidence replaces solvency. Trust becomes currency until it isn't. The people learn new words: deficit, speculation, corruption. They learn them through pain, through empty cupboards and arbitrary enforcement, through watching the wealthy remain untouched while burden spreads downward. Contempt replaces fear. This is the critical shift. Fear stabilizes regimes. Contempt dissolves them. When authority becomes ridiculous, it loses its final defense. The court reacts by doubling down on performance. More spectacle, more ceremony, more distraction. This only sharpens the contrast. Perfume thickens as rot deepens. The king grows old, surrounded by luxury and silence. He understands more than he admits, but less than he needs to act. His confessions arrive too late to matter. Apologies do not feed families. Regret does not cancel debt. When he dies, there is no mourning. There is relief, not violent yet, just collective exhalation. The nation senses an ending, even if it cannot name the next act. The system passes intact to a successor, unprepared for what lies beneath the surface. The machine still runs. The walls still stand. The rituals still perform. But belief is gone. What remains is habit without conviction, authority without reverence, power without legitimacy. Perfume masking rot works only until hunger arrives. Hunger cuts through scent. The state has trained its elites to live beautifully and think narrowly. It has trained its people to endure quietly and resent deeply. When these two realities finally collide, the shock will be violent. Decay is not caused by excess, it is caused by insulation, by systems designed to protect leaders from the consequences of their decisions, by courts that hear applause but not anger. The smell lingers, the rot spreads, history observes without surprise. It has seen this choreography before. When perfume becomes policy, collapse is no longer a possibility. It is simply waiting for its cue. He is not built for theater. That is his first mistake. In a system that survives on illusion, sincerity reads as weakness. The new king inherits a stage already cracking, and he walks onto it carrying tools meant for a workshop. He likes order, real order, not ritualized hierarchy or symbolic dominance, but mechanisms that make sense when examined closely. Locks appeal to him because they obey rules. Cause leads to effect. Pressure applied produces predictable results. There is comfort in this logic. France offers none of it. He arrives with good intentions and bad timing. The debts are real now, no longer theoretical. Interest alone devours revenue. Reform is not optional. It is overdue. The problem is that reform requires confrontation, and confrontation terrifies him. He hesitates, not out of malice but temperament. Each decision feels final. Each choice risks catastrophe. So he delays, hoping clarity will emerge on its own. It never does. Around him, the court smells blood. Weakness invites advice. Advice multiplies into noise. Ministers argue, factions harden, every proposal threatens someone powerful. The king listens to all and commits to none. The machine grinds without direction. The people wait, at first patiently, then anxiously, then angrily. Bread prices spike again. Wages do not. Hunger simplifies politics. Complex explanations collapse into one question. Why is there no bread? The answer is structural, historical, mathematical. None of that matters. Hunger does not debate, it accuses. The king tries transparency. He opens books, publishes numbers. The public responds not with gratitude, but suspicion. Decades of secrecy have taught them that figures lie. Trust, once drained, does not refill easily. Pamphlets spread faster than policy. They simplify the king into a caricature. Clumsy, inept, controlled. His private life becomes public property. His body becomes political. The crown once sacred is now mockable. The queen absorbs hatred like a lightning rod. Foreign, visible, spending where others starve. The nuance is irrelevant. Symbolism does the damage. She becomes the face of excess in a hungry nation. The king notices the hostility too late. He believes himself misunderstood rather than rejected. He assumes goodwill still exists beneath anger. It does not. When crisis peaks, he does what absolute monarchs are not supposed to do. He asks permission. He summons representation. He revives institutions designed for a different century. This is not reform. It is panic-wearing procedure. The assembly convenes and immediately refuses its assigned role. The people's representatives understand leverage when they feel it. They demand structural change, not relief, not adjustment. Change. The king freezes. He wants compromise, but fears precedent. He wants authority, but fears force. He does both and neither. Accepts publicly, resists privately, the worst possible combination. Troops appear, rumors explode. The city interprets hesitation as threat. Fear accelerates into action. The crowd moves faster than the crown can think. The fortress falls. Symbols matter more than strategy. Once blood is spilled publicly, the illusion of control collapses. The king still exists, but belief does not. He tries again to reconcile. He wears the symbols of change. He smiles. He signs. The people no longer trust gestures. They watch actions, and actions betray intent. The escape attempt ends the argument. Flight clarifies everything. A king who tries to flee is not a protector. He is a liability. From that moment, the crowd does not want reform. It wants resolution. The trial is inevitable because the system no longer allows ambiguity. A monarch cannot exist as both ruler and suspect. The language changes. He is no longer king. He is a citizen with a surname. The transformation is surgical. Divinity is stripped away through vocabulary. The verdict is decided before deliberation begins. This is not justice. It is closure. The revolution requires a body to anchor itself. History demands ritual sacrifice. On the scaffold, he behaves with dignity. Too late. Decency cannot retroactively create authority. His final words are drowned out by drums because explanation no longer matters. The blade falls cleanly, efficient, democratic. The crowd exhales. Something ancient snaps. This is not the death of a man. It is the death of distance. The king bleeds like anyone else. The spell breaks permanently. The locksmith never understands the crowd because he never learned its language. Hunger, humiliation, impatience. Locks solve problems by isolating variables. Societies do not. When the head is lifted, the people do not see a villain punished. They see proof. Proof that power is physical. Proof that belief can be revoked. The machine built by the dynasty survives the execution. The bureaucracy continues. The capital remains the center. Authority does not vanish. It changes hands. What dies is the illusion that consent is optional. The crowd has learned its strength. It will not forget. History watches the basket fill and notes without emotion that systems rarely fall because they are cruel. They fall because they are slow, because they mistake patience for loyalty and hesitation for wisdom. The locksmith brought tools to a riot. The riot rewrote the rules. The body is gone. The head is displayed. The square empties, and then quietly, almost insultingly, the world keeps working. Clerks return to desks. Taxes are still collected. Orders are still stamped. Paris remains the center of gravity. The revolution discovers something unsettling almost immediately. Killing a king does not dismantle a system. It only vacates the chair. The machine hums on. This is the Bourbons' final irony. They do not survive as people, but they endure as architecture, as habit, as administrative instinct. The republic that replaces them inherits not freedom, but infrastructure. It inherits centralization so complete that dismantling it would require another revolution. No one has the appetite. The revolutionaries speak the language of rupture while governing through continuity. Ministries are renamed, not redesigned. Authority still flows downward from Paris. Orders still arrive from the center and ripple outward. The king is gone, but the reflex to obey remains. When chaos intensifies, the machine proves its worth. It can mobilize armies. It can extract resources. It can silence regions. It can concentrate will. All it needs is a driver ruthless enough to use it without pretending otherwise. He arrives on schedule. The new ruler does not claim divine right. He claims inevitability. He does not hide behind ritual. He weaponizes efficiency. He does not rule in velvet. He rules in uniforms. The crown is replaced by a hat, the throne by a saddle. The machine responds eagerly. This is not a betrayal of the Bourbon system. It is its logical conclusion. Centralization without legitimacy requires force. The apparatus was always waiting for someone who would stop apologizing for using it. The Bourbons had insisted that the state was their body. The revolution proved the inverse. Bodies are disposable. The state is permanent. Exile confirms the lesson. The surviving family wanders Europe like ghosts, clutching titles that no longer purchase obedience. They discover what power really is by its absence. No taxes, no soldiers, no paperwork, just memory. When restoration comes, it arrives stripped of illusion. The returned kings understand the danger. They compromise. They concede. They rule cautiously, aware that belief once broken cannot be commanded back into existence. They sit on a throne, balanced on precedent and fear. They survive briefly by remembering what their ancestors forgot. That authority is rented, not owned. The final failure is predictable. One last king mistakes endurance for forgiveness. He attempts to resurrect certainty in a world that now knows better. The response is swift, unromantic, administrative. He leaves not in chains, but in a carriage, unnoticed, irrelevant. The curtain falls without drama. The dynasty exits history the way it entered it, not with destiny, but with contingency. What remains is the inheritance. France keeps the centralized state, the strong executive, the suspicion of regional autonomy, the belief that solutions come from the capital and flow outward. Presidents replace kings. Palaces remain offices. The choreography changes. The steps do not. This is not failure. It is success of a different kind. The Bourbons built a machine so effective that even their enemies refused to dismantle it. They replaced the operator and kept the controls. The Republic governs from the spaces the monarchy built. It speaks in the administrative language the monarchy refined. It relies on the same vertical logic, the same appetite for unity, the same impatience with disorder. Revolutions change symbols faster than structures. The Bourbons learned this too late. Their heirs learned it briefly. History applies it permanently. The lesson is cold and unimpressed. Power is not a crown. It is not a palace. It is not even legitimacy. Power is a system that can survive contempt, executions, and slogans as long as it continues to function. The Bourbons believed they were indispensable. They were wrong. They believed the machine existed to serve them. It did, until it didn't. They built the modern state to make themselves untouchable. They succeeded. Then they taught the world how to remove a king without destroying the state that protected him. This is their true legacy, not Versailles, not etiquette, not mirrors. A blueprint for centralized authority so robust that it can host emperors, republics, and presidents without changing its shape. The dynasty ends. The structure remains. History closes the ledger without sentiment. The family mistook permanence of control for permanence of belief. When belief expired, the machine calmly transferred ownership. Power does not mourn its makers. It outlives them, unchanged, waiting for the next set of hands willing to pretend they invented it. The House of Bourbon is gone. The state they forged is still issuing orders.